Good morning. Welcome to the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center. My name is Julia Friedlander. I'm the C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of Geoeconomics. It is my distinct pleasure today to welcome my former boss from the Treasury Department, the Deputy Secretary, Justin Muzinich, for a discussion on the transatlantic economy. He'll start with a few opening remarks, and then we'll switch over to a moderated conversation with former National Security Advisor and Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council, Stephen Hadley. I would like to just extend a few thanks to some of our partners who are here with us today: Kostas Pantazopoulos, Penny Nass, Artur Latarovitz, and Michael Margolis. Thank you very much. And now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Justin.
Well, thank you, Julia, and my thanks also to Steve Hadley for moderating the discussion. Congratulations to the Atlantic Council on the opening of the Center for Geoeconomics. Having spent time carefully looking at your goals, the center is an extremely timely and worthwhile undertaking. More broadly, now more than ever, the Atlantic Council's mission of fostering a strong transatlantic relationship is important. COVID-19 has severely disrupted our economy and our way of life. As the world looks to the future, it is important that we not just restart economic growth, but that the right values guide us in a post-COVID world. That is why the transatlantic relationship is so important. It represents over 40% of the world's GDP and nearly half of global personal consumption. But it is about much more than the economy. It is a community of values that we cherish and live by and are prepared to defend. Our common belief in liberty and democracy makes this partnership a cornerstone of world stability. I believe that the pandemic has only highlighted how important our shared values are. I would like to focus the first part of my remarks today on the response to the pandemic in the United States and Europe, and then turn to several transatlantic policy areas where cooperation based on shared values is essential. Specifically, investment security, cryptocurrency, sanctions, and economic growth. Beginning with the pandemic response, the United States and Europe each mounted unprecedented economic programs. We moved quickly and boldly, dampening the macroeconomic shock and laying the groundwork to support the recovery that is occurring today, though there is, of course, much work to do. Our experience so far demonstrates that we need not operate from identical playbooks to work toward our shared goals of full employment and robust and inclusive growth. Both in the US and Europe, fiscal policies provided support for households amid sharp declines in employment and hours worked. This was achieved through a mix of unemployment insurance and job retention programs, but with varying weights. The United States relied more heavily on direct payments to households, including stimulus checks and unemployment insurance, while also promoting job retention through the Paycheck Protection Program. European policymakers focused on subsidizing company payrolls to retain workers through a variety of short-time work programs, which had been used during the global financial crisis, so were ready to be relaunched. Ultimately, both US and European fiscal policies have produced similar results. First, by maintaining a base level of household consumption through the worst of the pandemic, and subsequently by unleashing pent-up consumer demand. Retail sales have rebounded to above pre-pandemic levels, with both the US and Europe at 104% of 2019 averages. Monetary policy tools have also played an instrumental role in the response. With short-term interest rates constrained from below, asset purchase programs and lending facilities remain the primary workhorses for both the Fed and the ECB. Both central banks have increased their bond holdings at a record pace, as well as expanded their loan books. However, implementation of these programs differs. The ECB's targeted longer-term lending operations offer low-rate, long-duration loans to banks with built-in incentives to encourage lending. The Fed has stood up a wide array of direct lending facilities, several of which receive U.S. Treasury backing. While the specifics vary, the relative scale of operations is strikingly similar. From mid-March through August, the Fed's balance sheet has grown by 15 percentage points of GDP. Over the same time, the ECB's balance sheet swelled by 19 percentage points of GDP. Our strong responses have been mutually reinforcing, and as our economies recover, there are 4 areas where transatlantic cooperation will be vital. The first is investment security. Prior to the pandemic, the United States and many of our European partners were already collaborating on investment security. The pandemic has only increased the sense of urgency. The vulnerability of companies to takeovers increases in a crisis, and other countries are sensitive to this. There has been a recent groundswell of action by our transatlantic partners to either establish or update their investment review regimes. Many have reached out to us to benefit from our expertise, given our work through CFIUS. France, Germany, Italy, Finland, and Spain already had investment review regimes, but have taken further steps to protect themselves. Other European countries, such as Norway and Poland, have established new regimes. Still others, like Ireland and the Czech Republic, are considering legislation. Our competitors and adversaries will be relentless in their pursuit of cutting-edge technologies. If the US and Europe are unified on this issue, we can protect our values and enhance national security while embracing global growth. A second area where cooperation is critical is cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies are a fascinating topic because they have implications not only for private business, but also for a number of activities the government is responsible for. Consider, for instance, national security. One of the issues at the top of Treasury's mind is that digital currencies can potentially be used to evade existing legal frameworks, like those governing anti-money laundering and the countering of terrorist financing. Treasury has made it clear that the obligation to comply with US laws is the same, regardless of whether a transaction is denominated in traditional fiat currency or digital currency. Existing laws apply to digital assets in no uncertain terms. However, even if we could be assured that the private sector is complying with the letter and spirit of AML laws, there are important remaining concerns that government must consider, such as a digital currency's potential effects on the monetary base and financial stability. These are linked to a broader concern about what I will call governance. For instance, if a decade from now there were a desire for a stablecoin to go from fully reserved to partially reserved, or to shift its underlying mix of reserve currencies, this could alter money supply or cause financial disruption. Would such a decision be made by a private governing association or by a majority of coin holders? What if foreign actors had acquired a majority of the coins? In any case, would important decisions about our economic system have been taken out of the hands of government, accountable to the people? The speed and cost advantages of stablecoins are clear, and we of course value innovation and efficiency. However, digital currencies are not simply a means of payment, but depending on their structure, can shift some functions traditionally performed by government to the private sector. Therefore, policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic must continue to work together to take a very hard look at these issues. A third area where the US and Europe must work closely together is holding bad actors accountable. We have a joint obligation to ensure the financial system is not used to undermine the freedoms we value so deeply. To date, our efforts have made it more difficult for terrorists, criminals, and rogue regimes to move money around the world. And teams from the US and Europe are in frequent touch to identify illicit activities. Through the hard work of both the US and Europe at the Financial Action Task Force, virtually all countries are subject to a rigorous peer review that examines their ability to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing. Another example of excellent cooperation is on Syria sanctions. In June of this year, Treasury designated 24 individuals and entities in Syria. These designations reinforced actions taken by the European Union to hold the Syrian regime accountable for their mistreatment of the Syrian people. We will continue to work with our EU counterparts on potential targets. An even more recent example is the sanctions that the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the US imposed last week on Belarusian officials for rigging their presidential election. These officials can no longer easily access the international financial system. We hope these actions will result in a change in behavior and lead to free and fair elections soon, as well as make clear to others the costs of interfering in democratic processes. We also understand and share our European partners' concerns about the impact of sanctions on humanitarian assistance. Treasury has made it a top priority to ensure that our sanctions do not impede COVID-19 relief. We have a long history of authorizations and exemptions across our sanctions programs to ensure the flow of humanitarian assistance is not interrupted. On April 9, we reiterated this commitment in a statement that emphasized support for COVID-19 related aid. But we made sure to reinforce that this aid should occur through legitimate and transparent channels. The pandemic has tested the global financial environment, creating conditions ripe for money laundering, corruption, and fraud. We are committed to ensuring that bad actors do not take advantage of this pandemic to enrich themselves. A final topic I would like to discuss is the importance of growth. We, of course, value strong and broadly distributed growth because of the opportunities and hope it creates for our citizens. Liberty and self-determination are best realized in an environment with diverse and widely available economic opportunities that enable people to pursue their dreams. We have been very focused on this at Treasury, and I am proud of the progress we were able to make before the world's attention shifted to the coronavirus. In 2019, poverty rates hit an all-time low, and real median household income grew to an all-time high at a record pace of almost 7%, or more than $4,000 in a single year. The unemployment rate hit a 5-decade low, and all-time lows in unemployment were achieved for various minority groups, including African Americans and Latinos and Hispanics. Particularly notable was that wage growth at the bottom decile of the income distribution hit an all-time high and exceeded wage growth for the top decile of the income distribution. But growth is not only valuable because it increases living standards. It is also a vitally important safeguard of our shared values. This is the case for several reasons. First, a larger economy allows an increased ability to invest in the security programs which do so much to safeguard our way of life. This includes military personnel and equipment, intelligence services, and cutting-edge research. While this benefit of growth is easy to see, it is too often not part of the conversation. Second, as countries around the world make relative choices about who their partners will be, the faster we grow, the more attractive we are as partners. Growth means more purchasing power and more influence in international standard setting. This is especially important as the world adopts frontier technologies such as 5G, AI, and quantum computing. The larger our markets are, the more likely we will be able to set technology standards that protect our shared values. Third, maintaining the world's leading economies allows us to shape global financial market access. Increased economic growth makes our sanctions regimes more effective and raises the opportunity costs of malign activity, helping us deter bad actors and achieve our shared foreign policy goals. Finally, a strong economy is a testament to the benefits of our liberal democratic system and a counterpoint to top-down, state-led approaches. Our sustained growth and prosperity has been unmatched by competing economic systems. As other countries seek to achieve their vision of world order, it is as important as ever to demonstrate that we can continue to provide unparalleled and broadly distributed opportunity. To conclude, let me return to what is front of mind today, the COVID-19 crisis. I have always regarded public service as a privilege, and it has been a particular honor to be able to serve in this moment of national reckoning. Crises can bring into focus what is most important. And in the case of the transatlantic relationship, I hope it will do just that. Our shared values have guided our response to the crisis, and we must focus on these as we look to create a prosperous, free, and secure world. At times, Europe and the US will view individual policies differently. But on the scale of world affairs, these differences are small compared to the values we share. Let us remember what binds us together as we work side by side to shape a world of which future generations will be proud. Thank you.
Mr. Deputy Secretary, thank you so much for being with us today here at the Atlantic Council. We thank you so much for your remarks. And I want, if I can, to follow up on some of the things that you have mentioned. Let me begin with the issue of sanctions, if I might. The United States has imposed financial sanctions on a long list of countries. You mentioned Syria and Belarus, Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, Venezuela. It's a pretty long list. And do you have a fear that the US is overusing sanctions at this point, particularly unilateral sanctions? And will this eventually affect and threaten the role of the US dollar as the global reserve currency?
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. Thank you again for moderating the question section of this. It's an excellent question, and one we think a lot about. Let me first just step back because not everyone will be familiar with our sanctions process. Let me just talk a little bit about our sanctions process and then come more specifically to your question, especially about sort of unilateral use. Our sanctions process is an extremely thorough one. It really starts with a policy decision. We have a policy group within Treasury that, along with the National Security Council and the State Department, comes to a foreign policy view as to where sanctions might make sense. It then goes from that policy decision to a group in Treasury, what we call OIA, the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, which is a member of the intelligence community sitting within Treasury that goes on a fact-finding mission to make sure we really understand where money is flowing, who it's flowing between. Once we have all the facts, we go through a very thorough legal review and analysis to make sure that all legal thresholds are met. And finally, a group within Treasury called OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, imposes and administers sanctions. That's a lot of acronyms, especially for those who aren't in government. But the point is that the process is deeply research-based, highly professionalized, and highly attuned to rule of law issues. And along those lines, I'd say, Steve, compared to when you were in government, there may have been several hundred people focused on this work at Treasury. There are now 900 people focused on it. It's the largest group within Maine Treasury, and so we are really staffed up to do a very thorough job when we look at sanctions. More specifically to your question about sort of unilateral use, that is a narrative which is out there, but I actually don't think it captures the vast majority of the work that goes on day to day. If you look across the sanctions programs, I mean, for instance, take North Korea. In North Korea, we're very closely coordinated with the UN. Venezuela, very closely coordinated with Europe and Latin America. Russia, the Russian sanctions program is closely coordinated with Europe. Our Global Magnitsky program, which is our human rights program, is also closely coordinated with Europe. We do a lot under GLOMAG. And in fact, Europe is adopting a similar regime so that we can be even more in line in pursuing human rights violators. So listen, while there are, of course, times we will need to act alone based on our foreign policy interests, the vast majority of time, these programs are coordinated with our partners. And I think our partners really understand and appreciate what we can do to stop illicit flows. And, the partnerships are really very strong on the sanctions side.
And threaten ultimately of the role of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. Are you worried about that?
Yeah, I mean, for partially because our sanction program is so closely coordinated with our partners, and and they do see the value in it. I'm not worried about that. I think everyone understands, the value that our sanctions program, bring to the world.
Thank you so much. Let me go to an issue you raised in your comments, the issue of digital currencies. China is field testing a government sponsored digital currency. Facebook, of course, has proposed to develop a digital currency as a private sector initiative. And I'd like to hear a little bit more from you on Treasury's position on these efforts, and particularly whether Treasury has a plan for the US government developing its own digital currency. Why not? And what would be the pros and cons of a US government sponsored digital currency?
Sure. Another very good and timely question. It's something we're studying, and Lael Brainerd at the Fed gave some remarks on this recently. This is really a decision, which sits as much with the Fed as it does with Treasury. The Fed has a working group that is looking at this and studying it very carefully, a domestic working group. They're also part of an international working group looking at this question, as is Treasury. And the Fed has even partnered with MIT to do some research as to sort of the technology behind this. So there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes. The short answer is there's been no decision yet. I think the pros are, listen, there are clearly efficiency benefits and cost benefits to using a distributed ledger. And I also think more broadly, it's important for government to embrace innovation and not be scared by it. That said, there are a number of concerns and things that have to be studied to make sure if it is done, that it's done in a responsible way. I mentioned a few of these in my remarks. I mean, you want to make sure you're not making it easier for illicit activity to occur. You want to make sure you're not threatening financial stability. There are implications for the banking system that have to be carefully thought through. And there are also privacy implications. Does how much of consumers' daily transactions, should a government see sort of in a digital world, for instance? So there are a variety of factors that we and the Fed are thinking through.
Thank you so much. I want to ask you about something that was not in your remarks, but I know it's a subject on which you've spent a lot of time. And it goes like this. Concerns have been raised about the international tax system, that it does not properly calculate taxes for digital companies. As a result, the OECD has been conducting multilateral talks on a new international tax system. A number of European countries have announced plans for a unilateral digital services tax. I know Treasury has expressed some real concerns about that. This negotiation, these taxes seem to be a serious point of contention between the transatlantic partners. Would you please discuss the current U.S. position on this subject, and particularly the prospects for the talks, which I understand are going to resume next week on this subject?
Uh, sure. Let me just step back and talk about the problem, and then I'll talk about sort of our proposed solution and where we are in the talks. We do think there's an issue which has to be addressed, and that's why we are actively engaged at the OECD. I think the easiest way to understand the issue is that the current international tax system has, for many decades, been based on the concept of physical presence. You can be taxed in a country if you have a quote unquote physical presence there, for instance, a factory in that country. The issue arises because really of the shift towards intangible income and intangible value that's occurred. So just to unpack that a little bit, if you had looked at the S&P 500, for instance, in the mid 1970s, about 17% of the value of the S&P would have been in what was called intangible value, intellectual property, patents, other types of intangible value. If you look today, that number is closer to the mid 80s. And so when you combine that shift with a focus on physical presence, you can see that while, in the 70s, it might have been difficult to move a factory from one country or another to another to benefit from lower tax rates in another country. Today, it is easier to do business in country X, but move your intangible assets to country Y, where there's a lower tax rate. And so, the intuition that the tax system has to be updated to reflect a changing world, is something we understand, and that's why we're actively engaged at the OECD. What is difficult is really finding a solution. For those who follow this closely or who are sort of close to the tax world, there have been working level talks going on this week. I'd say there is progress on what is called Pillar 2. Again, for the tax folks out there, that's sort of the minimum tax regime. And there's been progress on implementing that in a way that is consistent with, U.S. tax law. Pillar 1 is more challenging. There's been progress on technical issues, but there is no agreement on Pillar 1. Some of the key big issues remain unaddressed, including whether to adopt a safe harbor approach, which is really what the U.S. is advocating. I should just add that there is very strong bipartisan support for the proposed U.S. solution and for ensuring that U.S. companies receive a fair deal. I spend a lot of time on the Hill, and the U.S. is really united on this issue.
Mr. Deputy Secretary, we're running a little short of time. Let me ask one last question rather briefly. You mentioned in your remarks the progress that was made pre-COVID, particularly by those in the lower income decile. That, of course, has been dramatically set back. That progress has been set back by COVID-19. Reports of growing inequality. This has gotten a lot of attention in Europe. How does the U.S. government see the issue, and what tools are available as we come out of the economic aspects of the COVID crisis to address this issue of inequality?
Thanks, Steve. Another sort of very insightful question. Listen, we agree on the goal. there's no question that broadly distributed growth and opportunity is just critically important to the country. All parts of the country have to benefit economically as the country grows. Near term, as part of the COVID response, we took a number of steps to try to soften the blow for those who might have been most affected by COVID, whether it was through unemployment checks, direct checks in the mail, the PPP program. But as we emerge from COVID, I think one of the most important things we can do to ensure that growth is broadly distributed is to ensure that we have wage growth and not just growth in asset values. Lower income Americans especially rely on wages and not the value of assets growing. And so as we're thinking about sort of the structure of the economy, we have to make sure the economy is dynamic enough to lead to wage growth. And that was really a driving focus of ours before COVID. And we were delighted to see the results through 2019.
We are regrettably out of time. Mr. Deputy Secretary, I want to thank you for being with us here at the Atlantic Council today, and particularly thank all those in the audience who've joined us. I think you've given us a lot to think of. Thank you so much, and thank our audience. And that's it for now from the Atlantic Council.
Thank you for having me.